American manufacturing was once the most powerful force on the face of the earth. There was a time, not so long ago, when America made almost everything: the clothes on your back, the car in your driveway, the steel in your bridges, the television in your living room, all of it stamped somewhere on the bottom with three words that meant something: Made in America. I'm Earl Kowalski. I spent 44 years building American cars, 27 on the line at Buick City in Flint, and the rest under the hood in my own shop. I carried a UAW card, United Auto Workers, and I believed in what that card meant. I had a front row seat to the long, quiet death of American manufacturing in the Rust Belt towns it left behind, and so did my father before me. This is the complete story of how American manufacturing, the machine that once built half of everything on Earth, slowly stopped making things through outsourcing, trade deals, and decisions made far from the factory floor, and what it cost us. Decisions that wiped out roughly 7 million manufacturing jobs over the course of 4 decades. To understand how far we fell, you have to understand how high we stood. At the end of the Second World War, the United States was the workshop of the world, and it was not even close. We had just outproduced every other nation on the planet combined. The tanks, the ships, the planes that won the war, all came pouring off American assembly lines. And when peace came, all that capacity turned to building for ourselves. By the late 1940s, this one country with a small fraction of the world's people was making around half of everything manufactured on the entire planet. Half. There has never been anything like it before or since. And it was spread across the whole northern half of the country in a great industrial belt. Detroit built the cars, Pittsburgh and a string of mill towns poured the steel. Akron, Ohio made the tires for the whole nation. The Carolinas spun the cotton and ran the textile mills. Cities you may never think about: Youngstown, Gary, Bethlehem, Flint, Buffalo, Cleveland were humming around the clock 3 shifts a day, making the physical stuff of modern life. They called it the manufacturing belt then. It was the beating heart of the country. And think about what those plants actually put in your house. The rubber for nearly every tire in the nation came out of Akron, Ohio. Goodyear, Firestone, Goodrich, all of it, in one city they called the rubber capital of the world. Your television was built here by names like RCA and Zenith. Your refrigerator and your washing machine came from Maytag in Newton, Iowa, or Whirlpool in Michigan. Your tools, your radio, your kid's bicycle, almost all of it was made by American hands in American towns. To buy something back then was usually to put a few dollars into the pocket of another working family a few states over. The whole country was wired together that way, factory to store to kitchen table, and the money stayed home. But the factories were only half of what got built. The other half was a kind of promise, and it is the part I miss the most. A man could walk out of high school, or off a farm, or up from the South with no money and no diploma, get hired into one of those plants, and build a whole good life out of it. A UAW card, a union card, meant a fair wage, health care, and a pension. It meant a brick house, a car, maybe a boat, and a little cottage up north. It meant your kids would do better than you did. For one extraordinary generation, an ordinary working man in America had something most people in history never dreamed of: security. The factory didn't just make things, it made the middle class. I came up in the tail end of that world. When I hired into Buick City in 1972, the parking lots stretched to the horizon and the future felt as solid as the cast iron we poured. My father had felt the same way at Ford's River Rouge plant in the 1950s. We both believed the work would always be there. We were both wrong, and the reasons we were wrong are the whole rest of this story. The first cracks showed in the 1970s. For 30 years, America had had the field almost to itself because the war had flattened everybody else's factories. But by the 70s, Germany and Japan had rebuilt with newer plants and newer ideas, and their goods started arriving on our shores, cheaper, often better made. The little Japanese cars that showed up during the oil crises of 1973 and 1979 were the first real shock, but it was happening across the board, in steel, in electronics, in everything. For the first time, the American factory had real competition, and we had gotten comfortable. The quality had slipped. The customers noticed. Then came the part that turned a slump into a collapse, and it was a decision, not an accident. American companies discovered they could make their products somewhere else for a fraction of the cost, outsourcing the work rather than paying American wages to do it here. First, they moved the work to the non-union South. Then they moved it out of the country entirely, to Mexico, to Asia, anywhere labor was cheap and there were no unions and no rules. The shipping container, that plain steel box, made it possible to haul goods cheaply across the whole world, and suddenly a factory in another country was just as close to the store shelf as a factory in Ohio. The math for a company was brutal and simple. Why pay an American worker a middle-class wage when someone overseas would do it for a few dollars a day? And the rules got rewritten to make it easy. In the Reagan era of the 1980s, a new doctrine took hold in American boardrooms, pushed by economists like Milton Friedman, that a company's only obligation was to its shareholders, not its workers or its community. That idea greased the wheels for everything that followed. Then in 1994, a trade agreement called NAFTA opened the borders with Mexico, and whole industries packed up and moved south. Then, around 2001, China entered the World Trade Organization, what economists call China's WTO accession, and Congress had already granted China Permanent Normal Trade Relations, or PNTR, in 2000 to make it happen. What followed was so large that economists simply call it the China shock. Researchers at MIT, David Autor and his colleagues Gordon Hanson and David Dorn, calculated that China's rise directly cost the United States somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 million manufacturing jobs in just the first decade. A flood of cheap manufactured goods came in, and an enormous share of what was left of American factory work went out through outsourcing and offshoring. In the span of about a decade, the United States lost something on the order of 1/3 of its remaining manufacturing jobs. Whole towns that had made things for 100 years went dark. The federal government did create a program to help. Trade Adjustment Assistance, or TAA, was supposed to retrain workers who lost their jobs to foreign competition. Most of the men I knew never saw a dime from it or found the retraining led nowhere near what they'd lost. A policy on paper is not the same as a life rebuilt. You could watch it happen product by product. The television, which America had invented and perfected, stopped being built here at all. The last big American TV plants closed and the whole industry moved to Asia. The same thing happened to the radio, the stereo, the home appliance. Akron stopped making the nation's tires. One by one, entire categories of things that had said "made in America" for generations quietly started saying "made somewhere else." And most people never even noticed the moment it slipped away. There was one more force at work, and it was happening in the boardrooms and on Wall Street. That Milton Friedman shareholder value doctrine I mentioned had fully taken root by the 1980s. A company's only real job, the thinking went, was to make its share price go up, this quarter no matter what. And closing a factory, laying off 1,000 people in Ohio and outsourcing the work to a cheaper place, made the share price go up. The men who did it were rewarded. The accountants called it efficiency. The town called it the end of the world. A plant that had paid for the schools and the churches and the Little League and the diner downtown would close, and the money that had circulated through a whole community for generations simply stopped. You can read the collapse in the names of single days. In Youngstown, Ohio, the 19th of September 1977 is remembered as Black Monday, the day the steel company announced it was shutting down and 5,000 men lost their jobs at once. The first domino in the fall of American steel, Bethlehem Steel, a company that had built the guns of 2 world wars and the steel for the Golden Gate Bridge, went bankrupt in 2001. Detroit, the richest city in America in my father's day, filed the largest municipal bankruptcy in the country's history in 2013. American manufacturing employment peaked around 1979 at nearly 20 million jobs. Over the decades that followed, it shed roughly 7 million of them. 7 million livelihoods, 7 million front doors that a paycheck used to walk through. And it left a landscape behind. If you drive through the old manufacturing belt today, they don't call it that anymore, they call it the Rust Belt, and you can see why. Mile after mile of dead factories with the windows broken out and the trees growing up through the floors. The Packard plant in Detroit, open to the sky. The great steel mills along the rivers, silent. Main streets, where every other storefront is dark. Photographers come from all over the world to take pictures of the ruins, the way people once photographed ancient Rome. And in the towns, you can see it in the people too. The good jobs gone, the young folks moved away, and a generation of men who were told their whole lives that if they worked hard with their hands, they would be okay, and then found out the deal had been quietly canceled. Now I want to be fair, because the story has another side, and I'm too old to pretend it doesn't. Some of this was real progress. The cars and the goods we buy today are, in a lot of ways, better and safer and cheaper than what we made in 1960. Automation, industrial robots, and computers did genuinely replace a lot of the back-breaking jobs, and that is not all bad. And America still makes an enormous amount of stuff by value. In dollar terms, we are still one of the largest manufacturers on Earth. But here is the thing the dollar figures hide. We make more value with far fewer people. The factory that once employed 10,000 now employs 1,000, and the other 9,000 families had to find something else, usually something that paid less and meant less. What we lost wasn't only the output. It was the jobs and the towns and the ladder that a working man used to climb. So that is the complete story, the way an old line worker sees it. America didn't stop making things because it had to. It stopped because, decision by decision, NAFTA, China's WTO accession, PNTR, the outsourcing of entire industries, the shareholder value doctrine, it became cheaper and more profitable to make them somewhere else. And because the people who paid the price, the UAW members, the men on the line and the towns they lived in, didn't have a seat at the table where those decisions got made. It was not a natural disaster. It was a choice, made 1,000 times over in boardrooms and trade deals across 40 years. I built these cars and I fixed them for 44 years, and I still believe the men and women of this country could build anything if we decided to. Now I want to hear from you. What did your town make? What plant did your father or your grandfather work at, and is it still standing? Tell me down in the comments where you're from and what they used to build there, because this is a story with millions of chapters, and I want to hear yours.